A Dictionary of the English Language. Published on 15 April 1755, and written by Samuel Johnson, A Dictionary of the English Language, sometimes published as Johnson's Dictionary, is among the most influential dictionaries in the history of the English language. There was dissatisfaction with the dictionaries of the period, so in June 1746, a group of London booksellers contracted Johnson to write a dictionary for the sum of 1,500 guineas, £1,575, equivalent to about £250,000 in 2021. Johnson took 7 years to complete the work, although he had claimed he could finish it in 3. He did so single-handedly, with only clerical assistants to copy the illustrative quotations that he had marked in books. Johnson produced several revised editions during his life. Until the completion of the Oxford English Dictionary 173 years later, Johnson's was viewed as the preeminent English dictionary. According to Walter Jackson Bate, the dictionary easily ranks as one of the greatest single achievements of scholarship and probably the greatest ever performed by one individual who labored under anything like the disadvantages in a comparable length of time. Background. In earlier times, books had been regarded with something approaching veneration, but by the mid-18th century this was no longer the case. The rise of literacy among the general public, combined with the technical advances in the mechanics of printing and bookbinding, meant that for the first time, books, texts, maps, pamphlets, and newspapers were widely available to the general public at a reasonable cost. Such an explosion of the printed word demanded a set of grammar, definition, and spelling for those words. This could be achieved by means of an authoritative dictionary of the English language. In 1746, a consortium of London's most successful printers, including Robert Dodsley and Thomas Longman, none could afford to undertake it alone, set out to satisfy and capitalize on this need by the ever-increasing reading and writing public. Johnson's dictionary was not the first English dictionary, nor even among the first dozen. Over the previous 150 years, more than 20 dictionaries had been published in England, the oldest of those being a Latin-English word book by Sir Thomas Eliot, published in 1538. The next to appear was by Richard Mulcaster, a headmaster, in 1583. Mulcaster compiled what he termed a general table of 8,000 words we commonly use, yet it were a thing very praiseworthy, if some well-learned would gather all words which we use in the English tongue into one dictionary. In 1598, an Italian-English dictionary by John Florio was published. It was the first English dictionary to use quotations, illustrations, to give meaning to the word. In none of these dictionaries so far were there any actual definitions of words. This was to change, to a small extent, in schoolmaster Robert Cowdrey's Table Alphabetical, published in 1604, though it contained only 2,449 words, and no word beginning with the letters W, X, or Y. This was the first monolingual English dictionary. Several more dictionaries followed, in Latin, English, French, and Italian. Benjamin Martin's Lingua Britannica Reformata, 1749, and Ainsworth's Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, 1737, are both significant, in that they define entries in separate senses or aspects of the word. In English, among others, John Cowell's Interpreter, a law dictionary, was published in 1607. Edward Phillips' The New World of English Words came out in 1658, and a dictionary of 40,000 words had been prepared in 1729 by Nathan Bailey, though none was as comprehensive in breadth or style as Johnson's. The problem with these dictionaries was that they tended to be little more than poorly organized and poorly researched glossaries of hard words that were technical, foreign, obscure, or antiquated. But perhaps the greatest single fault of these early lexicographers was, as historian Henry Hitchings put it, that they failed to give sufficient sense of the English language as it appeared in use. In that sense, Dr. Johnson's dictionary was the first to comprehensively document the English lexicon. Johnson's preparation. Johnson's dictionary was prepared at 17 Gough Square, in London, an eclectic household, between the years of 1746 and 1755. By 1747, Johnson had written his Plan of a Dictionary of the English Language, which spelled out his intentions and proposed methodology for preparing his document. He clearly saw benefit in drawing from previous efforts, and saw the process as a parallel to legal precedent, possibly influenced by Cowell. I shall, therefore, since the rules of style, like those of law, arise from precedents often repeated, collect the testimonies of both sides, and endeavor to discover and promulgate the decrees of custom, who has so long possessed, whether by right or by usurpation, the sovereignty of words. Johnson's plan received the patronage of Philip Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield, but not to Johnson's pleasure. Chesterfield did not care about praise, but was instead interested by Johnson's abilities. 7 years after first meeting Johnson to discuss the work, Chesterfield wrote 2 anonymous essays in The World that recommended the dictionary. He complained that the English language was lacking structure and argued, "We must have recourse to the old Roman expedient in times of confusion and choose a dictator. Upon this principle, I give my vote for Mr. Johnson to fill that great and arduous post." However, Johnson did not appreciate the tone of the essay, and he felt that Chesterfield had not made good on his promise to be the work's patron. In a letter, Johnson explained his feelings about the matter. 7 years, my lord, have now passed since I waited in your outward rooms or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favor. Such treatment I did not expect, for I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labors, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it. The text. A dictionary of the English language was somewhat large and very expensive. Its pages were 18 inches, 46 centimeters tall, and nearly 20 inches, 51 centimeters wide. The paper was of the finest quality available, the cost of which ran to nearly £1,600, more than Johnson had been paid to write the book. Johnson himself pronounced the book vasta mole superbus, proud in its great bulk. No bookseller could possibly hope to print this book without help. Outside a few special editions of the Bible, no book of this heft and size had even been set to type. The title page reads, "A Dictionary of the English Language. The words are deduced from their originals and illustrated in their different significations by examples from the best writers, to which are prefixed a history of the language and an English grammar, by Samuel Johnson, A.M., in 2 volumes, Volume 1. The words Samuel Johnson and English language were printed in red, the rest was printed in black. The preface and headings were set in 4.6 mm English type. The text, double-columned, was set in 3.5 mm pica. This first edition of the dictionary contained a 42,773-word list, to which only a few more were added in subsequent editions. One of Johnson's important innovations was to illustrate the meanings of his words by literary quotation, of which there are around 114,000. The authors most frequently cited by Johnson include Shakespeare, Milton, and Dryden. For example, opulence, wealth, riches, affluence. There in full opulence a banker dwelt, who all the joys and pangs of riches felt. His sideboard glittered with imagined plate, and his proud fancy held a vast estate. Jonathan Swift. Furthermore, Johnson, unlike Bailey, added notes on a word's usage, rather than being merely descriptive. Unlike most modern lexicographers, Johnson introduced humor or prejudice into quite a number of his definitions. Among the best known are excise, a hateful tax levied upon commodities and adjudged not by the common judges of property, but wretches hired by those to whom excise is paid. Lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. Oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. A couple of less well-known examples are monsieur, a term of reproach for a Frenchman; patron, one who countenances, supports, or protects, commonly a wretch who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery, which some have understood to be a jab at his patron, Philip Stanhope. He included whimsical, little-known words, such as ridative, a word of Pope's, not to be imitated. Increase of years makes men more talkative, but less ridative. To that degree, I now write letters of plain how days. On a more serious level, Johnson's work showed a heretofore unseen meticulousness. Unlike all the proto-dictionaries that had come before, painstaking care went into the completeness when it usually came not only to illustrations, but also to definitions as well. Turn had 16 definitions with 15 illustrations. Time had 20 definitions with 14 illustrations. Put ran more than 5,000 words spread over 3 pages. Take had 134 definitions, running 8,000 words over 5 pages. The original goal was to publish the dictionary in 2 folio volumes, A through K and L through Z. But that soon proved unwieldy, unprofitable, and unrealistic. Subsequent printings ran to 4 volumes. Even these formed a stack 10 inches, 25 centimeters tall, and weighed in at nearly 21 pounds, 9.5 kilograms. A citation needed. In addition to the sheer physical heft of Johnson's dictionary, came at an equally hefty price, £4.10, equivalent to approximately £705 in 2021. So discouraging was the price that by 1784, 30 years after the first edition was published, when the dictionary had by then run through 5 editions, only 6,000 copies were in circulation, an average sale of 200 books a year for 30 years. A citation needed. Johnson's etymologies would be considered poor by modern standards, and he gave little guide to pronunciation, one example being cough, a convulsion of the lungs, vellicated by some sharp serosity. It is pronounced cough. Much of his dictionary was prescriptivist. It was also linguistically conservative, advocating traditional spellings such as public with a K, rather than the simpler spellings that would be favored 73 years later by Noah Webster. In spite of its shortcomings, the dictionary was far and away the best of its day. Its scope and structure were carried forward in dictionaries that followed, including Noah Webster's Webster's Dictionary in 1828 and the Oxford English Dictionary later in the same century. Reception history. Initial reception. From the beginning, there was universal appreciation, not only of the content of the dictionary, but also of Johnson's achievement in single-handedly creating it. When Boswell came to this part of Johnson's life, more than 3 decades later, he pronounced that the world contemplated with wonder so stupendous a work achieved by one man, while other countries had thought such undertakings fit only for whole academies. The dictionary was considered, from the moment of its inception, to be Johnson's, and from the time of its completion it was Johnson's dictionary. His book and his property, his monument, his memorial. Immediately after publication, the dictionary was enthusiastically written up in important periodicals such as the London Magazine and, none too surprisingly, the Gentleman's Magazine. In the latter, it received an 8-page notice. Reviews, such as they were, proved to be generous in tone. Of the less positive assessments, the only properly judicious one came from Adam Smith in the pro-Whig Edinburgh Review. He wished that Johnson had oftener passed his own censure upon these words, which are not of approved use, though sometimes to be met with in authors of no mean name. Furthermore, Johnson's approach was not sufficiently grammatical. Despite the dictionary's critical acclaim, Johnson's general financial situation continued in its dismal fashion for some years after 1755. The image of Johnson racing to write Rasselas to pay for his mother's funeral, romantic hyperbole though it is, conveys the precariousness of his existence, almost 4 years after his work on the dictionary was done. His financial uncertainties continued. He gave up the house in Gough Square in March 1759, probably for lack of funds. Yet, just as Johnson was plunging into another trough of despondency, the reputation of the dictionary at last brought reward. In July 1762, Johnson was granted a state pension of £300 a year by the 24-year-old monarch, George III. The pension did not make him rich, but it ensured he would no longer have to grub around for the odd guinea. Criticism. As lexicography developed, faults were found in Johnson's work. From an early stage there were noisy detractors. Perhaps the loudest of them was John Horne Tooke. Not content to pronounce it imperfect and faulty, he complained that it was one of the most idle performances ever offered to the public, that its author possessed not one single requisite for the undertaking, that its grammatical and historical parts were most truly contemptible performances, and that nearly 1/3 is as much the language of the Hottentots as of the English. Horace Walpole summed up for the unbelievers when he pronounced at the end of the 18th century, I cannot imagine that Dr. Johnson's reputation will be very lasting. His dictionary was a surprising work for one man, but the task is too much for one man, and a society should alone pretend to publish a standard dictionary. Notwithstanding Walpole's reservations, the admirers outnumbered the detractors, and the reputation of the dictionary was repeatedly boosted by other philologists, lexicographers, educationalists, and word detectives. Johnson's dictionary was made when etymology was largely based on guesswork. His classical leanings led him to prefer spellings that pointed to Latin or Greek sources, while his lack of sound scholarship prevented him from detecting their frequent errors. For example, he preferred spelling ache, A-C-H-E, over ake, A-K-E, as he wrongly thought it came from the Greek akos. Some of his spelling choices were also inconsistent. While retaining the Latin P in receipt, he left it out of deceit. He spelled Dane one way and disdain another. He spelled uphill with 2 L's, but downhill with 1, muckhill with 2 L's, but dunghill with 1, instill with 2 L's, but distill with 1, enthrall with 2 L's, but disenthrall with 1. Boswell relates that a lady once asked him how he came to define pastern as the knee of a horse. Instead of making an elaborate reply, as she expected, he at once replied, "Ignorance, madam, pure ignorance." On the same page, Boswell notes that Johnson's definition of network, anything reticulated or decussated, at equal distances, with interstices between the intersections, has often been quoted with sportive malignity, as obscuring a thing in itself very plain. Influence in Britain. Despite the criticisms, the influence of the dictionary was sweeping. Johnson established both a methodology for how dictionaries should be put together and a paradigm for how entries should be presented. Anyone who sought to create a dictionary post-Johnson did so in his shadow. In his History of the Oxford English Dictionary, Simon Winchester asserts of its 18th century predecessor that by the end of the century, every educated household had or had access to the great book. So firmly established did it swiftly become that any request for the dictionary would bring forth Johnson and none other. One asked for the dictionary, writes Winchester, much as one might demand the Bible. One of the first editors of the OED, James Murray, acknowledged that many of Johnson's explanations were adopted without change, for when his definitions are correct and his arrangement judicious, it seems to be expedient to follow him. In the end, the OED reproduced around 1,700 of Johnson's definitions, marking them simply J. Reputation abroad. Johnson's influence was not confined to Britain and English. The president of the Florentine Academia declared that the dictionary would be a perpetual monument of fame to the author, an honor to his own country in particular, and a general benefit to the Republic of Letters. This was no empty commendation. Johnson's work served as a model for lexicographers abroad. It is no surprise that his friend Giuseppe Baretti chose to make the dictionary the model for his Italian-English dictionary of 1760 and for his Spanish dictionary nearly 2 decades later. But there are numerous examples of influence beyond Johnson's own circle. His work was translated into French and German, and in 1777, when Ferdinando Barbarelli purchased a pocket dictionary of Italian, French, and English, the 3 languages side by side, his authorities for the French and Italian words were the works of the French and Italian academies. For the English, he used Johnson. Influence in America. The dictionary was exported to America. The American adoption of the dictionary was a momentous event, not just in its history, but in the history of lexicography. For Americans in the second half of the 18th century, Johnson was the seminal authority on language, and the subsequent development of American lexicography was colored by his fame. For American lexicographers, the dictionary was impossible to ignore. America's 2 great 19th century lexicographers, Noah Webster and Joseph Emerson Worcester, argued fiercely over Johnson's legacy. In 1789, Webster declared that Great Britain, whose children are we, and whose language we speak, should no longer be our standard, for the taste of her writers is already corrupted and her language on the decline. Where Webster found fault with Johnson, Joseph Worcester saluted him. In 1846, he completed his Universal and Critical Dictionary of the English Language. He defended Johnson's work, arguing that from the time of its publication, it has been, far more than any other, regarded as the standard for the language. Notwithstanding the evolution of lexicography in America, the dictionary has also played its part in the law, especially in the United States. Legislators are much occupied with ascertaining first meanings, with trying to secure the literal sense of their predecessors' legislation. Often it is a matter of historicizing language. To understand a law, you need to understand what its terminology meant to its original architects. As long as the American Constitution remains intact, Johnson's dictionary will have a role to play in American law. Folio and Abridged editions. Johnson's dictionary came out in two forms. The first was the 1755 Folio edition, which came in 2 large volumes on 4 April. The Folio edition also featured full literary quotes by those authors that Johnson quoted, such as Dryden and Shakespeare. It was followed a few weeks later by a second edition, published in 165 weekly parts. The third edition was published in 1765, but it was the fourth, which came out in 1773, which included significant revisions by Johnson of the original work. The Abridged edition came out in 1756 in 2 octavo volumes with entries abstracted from the Folio edition by the author, laid out as 2 columns per page. The Abridged version did not feature the literary quotes, just the author quoted. This made it cheaper to produce and buy. It sold over 1,000 copies a year for the next 30 years, bringing the dictionary to the reach of every literate home. Modern editions. Johnson's dictionary has been available in replica editions for some years. The entire first Folio edition is available on A Dictionary of the English Language as an electronic scan. As of April 15, 2021, A Dictionary of the English Language will become Johnson's Dictionary Online, a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and created by a team of scholars at the University of Central Florida. This version is the first fully searchable online edition and will eventually include the 1775 Folio edition. The preface to the dictionary is available on Project Gutenberg. In addition, a scan of the 6th, 1785 edition can be found on the Internet Archive in its 2 volumes. In popular culture, the compilation of Johnson's dictionary was the main plotline for an episode of Blackadder III, where Edmund Blackadder, Rowan Atkinson, after confounding the scholar with a barrage of fabricated non-existent words, tries to conceal the destruction of the dictionary's manuscript by his servant. Johnson had given his only manuscript to the prince, and was presumably destroyed by Blackadder's apprentice dog's body, Baldric. The episode ends with Baldric obliviously throwing the dictionary into the fire.